Sophia will never understand complex financial portfolios anyway. She barely knows how to balance a checkbook. Those were the words I heard through our bedroom door when I returned early from visiting my terminally ill aunt. My husband of 12 years, Marcus, was speaking to someone on the phone, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty that would soon destroy everything I thought I knew about our marriage. What he did not know was that within 24 hours, $20 million would land in my account from that same aunt's estate, and the woman he thought was financially helpless would become the architect of the most sophisticated revenge in Silicon Valley history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that would forever divide my life into before and after began like countless others in our Mediterranean-style home in Palo Alto, California. At 38 years old, I had built what appeared to be an enviable existence as the wife of Marcus Chen, a successful venture capitalist whose portfolio included 3 unicorn startups and whose annual income exceeded $2 million. Our marriage had produced 2 beautiful children, Emma, 14, and Lucas, 11, both excelling in their private school academics and various extracurricular pursuits that filled our calendar with recitals, games, and parent-teacher conferences. To the outside observer, we represented the quintessential Silicon Valley power couple. Marcus commanded respect in boardrooms across San Francisco, while I managed our domestic affairs with the efficiency of someone who understood that supporting a high-achieving spouse required strategic thinking and flawless execution. Our social calendar included charity galas, tech industry events, and intimate dinner parties with entrepreneurs whose companies would later become household names. We owned a second home in Napa Valley, took annual vacations to European destinations, and maintained investment accounts that would have provided comfortable retirement by age 55. However, beneath this polished exterior lay a relationship dynamic that had slowly eroded my sense of self-worth and professional identity over the past decade. When Marcus and I married in 2011, I had been pursuing my doctorate in behavioral economics at Stanford University, while working as a research analyst for an economic consulting firm that advised Fortune 500 companies on consumer behavior patterns. My thesis research focused on decision-making processes in high-stakes financial environments, work that had attracted attention from several prestigious think tanks and consulting organizations. The transition from independent professional to supportive spouse had been gradual and seemingly logical. Marcus's career demands required extensive travel, long hours, and constant availability for deal-making opportunities that could not wait, for convenient scheduling. When Emma was born in 2009, we made the practical decision that I would pause my doctoral studies to provide stable childcare while Marcus built his venture capital fund. The arrangement was intended to be temporary, lasting perhaps 2 years until we could afford full-time professional childcare and I could return to completing my degree. 2 years became 5 when Lucas arrived and Marcus's career reached new heights of success and complexity. 5 years became 10 when his fund raised a $300 million investment vehicle that demanded his complete attention for 18 months of due diligence, fundraising, and portfolio management. By the time I seriously considered returning to my research, the academic world had moved beyond my previous work. My professional network had dispersed into new positions, and my confidence in my analytical abilities had been systematically undermined by Marcus's subtle but persistent suggestions that I lacked the intellectual capacity for high-level business analysis. "Economics is really complex stuff, Sophia," he would say when I attempted to discuss market trends or investment strategies that I had been following through financial publications and online courses. "Why don't you focus on what you do best, managing our family and social obligations? And let me handle the money stuff?" These comments, delivered with a patronizing smile and accompanied by a pat on my shoulder, effectively silenced my attempts to engage with the professional world that had once been my expertise. Over time, I internalized Marcus's assessment of my capabilities. Perhaps my previous academic success had been a fluke, Perhaps the economic consulting work I had performed had been less sophisticated than I remembered. Perhaps my attempts to understand complex financial instruments and market dynamics were indeed beyond my intellectual capacity. The woman who had once analyzed billion-dollar corporate strategies began to doubt her ability to understand our family's investment portfolio. This systematic undermining of my confidence served Marcus's purposes in ways I would not understand until much later. By positioning himself as the sole financial decision-maker in our household, he gained complete control over our assets, income, and spending decisions without the oversight or input that an intellectually confident wife might have provided. I signed documents without reading them carefully, approved investments without conducting independent research, and trusted his explanations of our financial situation without seeking verification from outside sources. The irony was devastating. In retrospect, while Marcus spent his professional hours evaluating the business acumen and strategic thinking of entrepreneurs seeking venture capital funding, he had convinced his wife, someone with advanced training in economic analysis, that she was incapable of understanding basic financial concepts. The woman who had once published research papers on investment psychology in peer-reviewed journals now apologetically asked for explanations of terms like asset allocation and portfolio diversification that she had mastered during her graduate studies. My social identity reinforced this intellectual diminishment. In Silicon Valley circles, venture capitalist wives were expected to be accomplished but not competitive, educated but not threatening, supportive but not independent. I attended charity luncheons where conversations focused on interior design, trends, and European vacation destinations rather than the market conditions and technological innovations that were reshaping global commerce. I volunteered for school fundraising committees where my organizational skills were valued, but my analytical capabilities were never requested or acknowledged. The transformation was so gradual that I failed to recognize its completion until the moment of crisis forced me to confront what I had become. The confident graduate student who had once presented research findings to roomfuls of senior economists had become someone who sought her husband's permission before making purchases over $500. The woman who had analyzed complex data sets and identified investment opportunities had become someone who claimed ignorance about our family's financial holdings when asked about them at social gatherings. However, one element of my former intellectual life had never completely disappeared. Throughout my years as a full-time wife and mother, I had maintained my subscription to academic journals, economic publications, and financial newsletters that kept me connected to developments in behavioral economics and market analysis. I justified this continued learning as a personal interest rather than professional development, reading in the early morning hours before the family woke, or during school hours when household management allowed for brief intellectual pursuits. These reading habits proved more significant than I initially understood. While Marcus dismissed my intellectual capabilities and I increasingly doubted them myself, I was unconsciously maintaining and developing analytical skills that would prove crucial when circumstances forced me to reclaim my professional competence. The academic papers on investment psychology informed my understanding of Marcus's behavior patterns in ways that would later allow me to predict and counter his strategies. The market analysis publications provided insights into venture capital, trends that would help me understand the true state of our finances when I finally gained access to complete information. Most importantly, my Aunt Vivian had never stopped believing in my intellectual capabilities, despite my own loss of confidence. Vivian Chen, my father's sister who had built a biotechnology empire from a single patent into a $2 billion pharmaceutical company, had watched my marriage with growing concern about the changes she observed in my personality and intellectual engagement. During our monthly lunch meetings, she would probe gently about my thoughts on economic trends, technological developments, and business strategies, refusing to accept my claims of ignorance and instead drawing out insights that revealed my underlying analytical abilities remained intact. "Intelligence is not something you lose, Sophia," she had told me during our last conversation 6 months before her death. It is something that can be suppressed or encouraged, but it cannot be destroyed. When the time comes that you need your full capabilities, you will discover they have been there all along, waiting for you to reclaim them. At the time, I had dismissed her words as the kind of encouraging platitudes that caring relatives offer when they sense personal struggles. I had no way of knowing that Vivian had been preparing for the possibility that I might one day need both encouragement and resources to rebuild the professional identity that my marriage had systematically dismantled. Her $20 million inheritance would provide the resources, but the encouragement had been building my confidence for years through conversations that treated me as the intellectual equal I had forgotten I could be. The betrayal I was about to discover would shatter the comfortable delusions that had sustained my marriage for over a decade. However, it would also force me to confront the intellectual capabilities I had allowed to lie dormant and the professional potential I had surrendered in exchange for domestic security. Marcus had succeeded in convincing me that I was financially naive and intellectually limited. He was about to discover that his greatest success had also created the conditions for his most devastating failure. The woman he thought was too simple to understand complex financial portfolios was about to demonstrate strategic thinking sophisticated enough to outmaneuver venture capital professionals who commanded multi-million-dollar investment funds. The wife he had trained to seek his approval for household purchases was about to deploy $20 million in resources with the precision of someone who understood exactly how money could be used to create leverage, influence, and ultimately, justice. But first, I had to discover the full scope of his betrayal, and that revelation would come through a conversation I was never meant to hear, in a house where I thought I was safe, about financial decisions that would destroy everything I believed about the man I had loved for 12 years. The foundation of my comfortable ignorance was about to crumble, and in its place would emerge a woman whose intellectual capabilities had been dormant but never destroyed, whose strategic thinking had been suppressed but never eliminated, and whose capacity for sophisticated revenge would surprise everyone who had underestimated her, including herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Chen had spent 12 years teaching his wife to doubt her intelligence and financial competence. He was about to learn that his most successful manipulation had created his most dangerous opponent. The woman who asked for permission to spend $500 was about to teach him what $20 million could accomplish when deployed by someone who finally understood her own power. The transformation would begin with a single overheard conversation, but it would end with the complete reconstruction of everything Marcus thought he knew about money, power, and the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. The foundation of betrayal was about to become the catalyst for the most extraordinary comeback in Silicon Valley history. The phone call that would change everything was about to begin, and I was about to discover that the man I trusted with my financial security had been systematically stealing not just my money, but my children's future, my security, and my sense of self-worth. However, he had also unknowingly created the perfect conditions for demonstrating that revenge, when executed with sufficient intelligence and resources, could become a form of justice that would protect other women from experiencing the same betrayal. The conversation I was about to overhear would destroy my marriage, but it would also rebuild my confidence, reclaim my professional identity, and reveal capabilities that 12 years of systematic undermining had never actually eliminated. Marcus thought he was talking to his mistress about plastic surgery funded by stolen marital assets. He was actually providing the evidence that would transform his financially dependent wife into his most formidable opponent. The woman who had been trained to believe she could not understand complex financial portfolios was about to prove that she could dismantle her husband's entire professional and personal life with the precision of someone who had never forgotten how to think strategically. She had simply been convinced to stop trying. The foundation of betrayal was complete. The transformation was about to begin. And Marcus Chen had no idea that his greatest victim was about to become his most sophisticated adversary. The 3-hour drive from Aunt Vivian's estate in Carmel back to Palo Alto had provided me with time to process the emotional weight of her final days and the unexpected responsibility of serving as executor of her will. The hospice care team had warned me that her condition was deteriorating rapidly, but nothing had prepared me for the finality of watching someone who had been a pillar of strength throughout my life slip away with such dignified grace. Vivian had spent her last conscious hours not discussing her pain or fear, but rather offering advice about recognizing my own potential and never allowing others to define my capabilities for me. I had planned to stay through the weekend to handle initial estate matters, but Vivian's attorney had assured me that the most pressing legal requirements could be managed remotely until the formal reading of her will the following week. My children needed me at home for Emma's regional debate tournament and Lucas's championship soccer game, events that Marcus had already committed to missing due to what he described as critical investor meetings that required his immediate attention throughout the weekend. Arriving home at 2:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, I was surprised to find Marcus's Tesla in the garage alongside an unfamiliar silver Porsche Cayenne that suggested we had company. The house appeared quiet from the exterior, with no indication of a business meeting or social gathering that would explain the additional vehicle. I assumed that Marcus was conducting one of his informal investor conversations that occasionally moved from office settings to our home when the discussions required privacy or extended duration. I entered through the kitchen, setting down my overnight bag and the box of Vivian's personal papers that her attorney had asked me to review before our upcoming meeting. The house felt unusually warm, and I could hear the faint sound of conversation coming from the direction of our master bedroom suite upstairs. Marcus often took important calls in his home office, but the bedroom location struck me as unusual for business discussions, particularly on a Friday afternoon when most venture capital professionals would be concluding their work week. As I climbed the stairs toward our bedroom, intending to let Marcus know I had returned early and would be available to help with whatever business matter was requiring his attention, I began to distinguish the specific words of his conversation. What I heard in those first few moments would shatter not only my understanding of our marriage, but also my perception of the man I had trusted with 12 years of my life and the financial security of our children. The transfer went through. This morning, exactly as planned, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying the satisfied tone he typically used when describing successful deal negotiations. $250,000. Cleaned out both the joint checking and the money market accounts. She never pays attention to the monthly statements anyway, so we probably have at least 3 weeks before she notices anything unusual. My hand froze on the stair railing as the implications of his words penetrated my consciousness. Marcus was discussing transferring substantial amounts of money from our joint accounts without my knowledge or consent, and he was doing so with someone who clearly understood the deceptive nature of these transactions. The casual reference to my supposed financial inattention revealed not only his theft, but also his complete lack of respect for my intelligence and awareness. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, my heart pounding as I strained to hear the remainder of the conversation that would reveal the full scope of whatever scheme Marcus had been implementing behind my back. The voice responding to his update belonged to a woman whose tone carried an intimacy that made my stomach lurch with the recognition that this was not a business conversation at all. Marcus, are you absolutely certain she will not discover the missing money before Tuesday? The woman asked, her voice revealing anxiety that suggested significant personal stakes in whatever they were planning. Dr. Harrison's office requires the full payment up front, and if there are any complications with the funding, we will lose our surgery slot and have to wait another 4 months for rescheduling. Surgery. My husband had stolen $250,000 million from our family accounts to fund surgery for another woman. The realization hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to continue listening as the conversation revealed additional details that would help me understand. the complete scope of his betrayal. "Rachel, you worry too much," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the patronizing tone I recognized from his dismissive comments about my financial understanding. "Sophia barely knows how to balance a checkbook, let alone track complex account transfers. Even if she notices the missing money, I can easily convince her that it was moved for investment purposes or tax planning. She trusts me completely when it comes to financial decisions." Rachel. The name belonged to Rachel Morrison, a real estate agent specializing in luxury properties who had helped us purchase our Napa Valley home 3 years earlier. During that process, I had noticed the excessive attention she paid to Marcus and the flirtatious undertones in their professional interactions, but I had dismissed my concerns as paranoid jealousy rather than recognizing them as legitimate warning signs of inappropriate attraction. "I still cannot believe we are actually doing this," Rachel continued, her voice now carrying excitement that replaced her previous anxiety. "Full facial reconstruction, breast augmentation, and body contouring, with the most exclusive plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills. When the healing is complete, I will look like a completely different person." The scope of the surgical procedures Rachel was describing would cost far more than the $250,000 Marcus had mentioned transferring from our accounts. This realization led to the horrifying understanding that our joint accounts represented only a portion of the money he had stolen to fund his mistress's complete physical transformation. "The facial work alone is worth every dollar," Marcus responded with enthusiasm that revealed his deep emotional investment in Rachel's appearance modification. "Dr. Harrison showed me the computer simulations of the expected results, and the transformation will be absolutely stunning. You will finally have the face and body that match the incredible woman you are inside." The intimate tone of his comment made clear that this was not simply a financial transaction, but rather an expression of romantic devotion that involved spending what I estimated to be several $100,000 on cosmetic surgery for a woman who was not his wife. Marcus was not only betraying our marriage vows and stealing our family's financial security, but he was doing so to fund a complete physical makeover for his mistress that would presumably facilitate their future relationship. "What about the other accounts?" Rachel asked, apparently referring to additional sources of funding that Marcus had accessed to cover the full cost of her surgical procedures. "Were you able to transfer the money from the children's education funds without triggering any notification systems?" Children's education funds. Marcus had stolen money specifically saved for Emma and Lucas's college expenses, funds that we had been building for over a decade through monthly contributions and careful investment management. The violation was not limited to our marital assets, but extended to theft of resources intended to secure our children's educational futures. "Those transfers required more sophisticated handling," Marcus explained with the pride of someone who believed he had successfully executed a complex financial scheme. "I moved the money through 3 intermediate accounts to avoid automatic alerts, then categorized the withdrawals as investment reallocation rather than account closure. The documentation will show strategic portfolio management rather than liquidation." The technical sophistication of his theft revealed that this was not an impulsive decision driven by temporary infatuation, but rather a carefully planned scheme that had required months of preparation and strategic thinking. Marcus had systematically identified our family's financial assets, developed methods to access them without my knowledge, and created documentation designed to conceal his theft, even if I eventually discovered the missing funds. "How much total are we talking about?" Rachel asked, apparently seeking confirmation of the complete amount Marcus had stolen to fund her transformation and their future together. "Including the education funds, the joint accounts, and my personal investment portfolio that I liquidated. Last month, we have $875,000 available for the surgery and our relocation expenses," Marcus replied with satisfaction. "That covers Dr. Harrison's fees, the recovery period in Malibu, and enough capital for us to establish ourselves in Los Angeles while I build my new venture capital practice." $875,000. Marcus had stolen nearly $1 million from our family's assets to fund not only Rachel's plastic surgery, but also their planned escape to a new life in Southern California. The theft was not simply about funding cosmetic procedures, but rather about liquidating our marriage and family's financial foundation to create resources for his new relationship and career relocation. Marcus, I still feel guilty about taking money that belongs to your children, Rachel said, though her tone suggested that her guilt was not sufficient to prevent her from accepting the stolen funds. Are you certain that Sophia will not be able to trace these transactions back to the surgical expenses? Rachel, you need to stop worrying about Sophia, Marcus replied with irritation that revealed his impatience with Rachel's concerns about the impact on his family. She has never shown any interest in understanding our financial situation beyond making sure there is money available for household expenses and social activities. Even if she eventually notices the missing funds, she lacks the analytical skills to reconstruct complex transaction patterns or understand the legal implications of what occurred. The casual cruelty of his assessment struck me more deeply than the financial theft itself. Marcus was not only stealing our family's money, but he was doing so with complete confidence that I was too intellectually limited to discover his scheme or respond effectively if I did uncover his betrayal. His systematic undermining of my confidence over the past decade had been so successful that he believed I would be helpless even when confronted with evidence of his theft. Besides, Marcus continued, once the divorce is finalized and we are established in Los Angeles, Sophia's financial situation will be irrelevant to our future. The prenuptial agreement limits her claim on my venture capital assets, and the stolen money will be impossible to recover once it has been spent on surgical procedures and relocation expenses. Prenuptial agreement. I had no memory of signing any such document, which meant either Marcus was lying to reassure Rachel, or he had somehow obtained my signature on legal documents without my understanding of their true nature. Given his demonstrated capacity for sophisticated financial deception, I realized that he might have obtained my signature on a prenuptial agreement by presenting it as routine investment paperwork or insurance documentation. When do we leave? For Los Angeles? Rachel asked, apparently eager to begin their new life together using money stolen from the family Marcus was abandoning. The moving company picks up our belongings next Friday while Sophia takes the children to her mother's house for their monthly visit, Marcus explained with the tone of someone who had carefully planned every aspect of his escape. By the time she returns Sunday evening, the house will be empty and I will have filed divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences. My attorney assures me that with the prenuptial agreement and evidence of Sophia's financial incompetence, the settlement will be minimal and processed quickly. Evidence of financial incompetence. Marcus had not only been stealing our money and planning his escape, but he had also been documenting interactions that he intended to use as legal evidence that I was incapable of managing financial affairs. His systematic undermining of my confidence had served the dual purpose of making me less likely to discover his theft, while creating documentation that would support his claims in divorce proceedings. The conversation continued with additional details about their planned escape, but I had heard enough to understand the complete scope of Marcus's betrayal. He had stolen nearly $1 million from our family accounts, planned to abandon his wife and children for a new life with his mistress, and structured the entire scheme to minimize his legal and financial obligations while maximizing the damage to his family's security and well-being. However, as I stood in the hallway processing the devastating implications of what I had discovered, I also began to recognize that Marcus had made several critical miscalculations that would provide me with opportunities to respond more effectively than he anticipated. His confidence in my financial incompetence was based on the submissive persona I had adopted during our marriage, not on any accurate assessment of my actual analytical capabilities. His assumption that I would be helpless to respond to his theft reflected his systematic underestimation of the intellectual abilities I had never actually lost. Most importantly, Marcus had no knowledge of Aunt Vivian's inheritance, which would provide me with financial resources that would dwarf the amount he had stolen and give me leverage that he could never anticipate. While he was planning his escape, with less than $1 million in stolen assets, I would soon have access to $20 million in legitimately inherited wealth that could be deployed with the strategic precision of someone who finally understood the true nature of the battle she was fighting. The woman Marcus thought was too simple to understand complex financial portfolios was about to demonstrate strategic thinking that would outmaneuver his carefully planned scheme. The wife he had trained to seek his approval was about to deploy resources and capabilities that would transform his confident escape into the most devastating miscalculation of his professional and personal life. I backed away from the bedroom door quietly, my mind already beginning to formulate the strategic response that would protect my children's future while ensuring that Marcus and Rachel faced consequences proportional to their betrayal. The foundation of comfortable ignorance that had sustained my marriage was gone forever, but in its place was emerging a clarity of purpose and intellectual confidence that I had not experienced since abandoning my doctoral studies 12 years earlier. Marcus Chen thought he had successfully stolen his family's financial security to fund his new life with his mistress. He was about to discover that his greatest victim possessed resources, capabilities, and strategic thinking skills that would transform his apparent victory into a defeat so comprehensive that it would serve as a cautionary tale for anyone who might consider similar betrayals. The catalyst moment was complete. The woman who had been systematically taught to doubt her intelligence was about to prove that intellectual capabilities, once awakened, could be deployed with devastating effectiveness. When combined with sufficient motivation and resources, the transformation from victim to strategist had begun, and Marcus had provided exactly the motivation needed to ensure that his lesson would be both thorough and unforgettable. The 23 minutes I spent standing motionless in my own hallway, processing the complete scope of Marcus's betrayal while listening to him plan his escape with his mistress, represented the final moments of the naive woman I had been for 12 years. When I finally moved away from that bedroom door, every step carried me further from the persona of financial dependence and intellectual submission that Marcus had so carefully cultivated, and closer to the strategic analyst I had been before. Marriage convinced me to abandon my professional identity. My immediate priority was extracting myself from the house without alerting Marcus and Rachel to my presence or my knowledge of their scheme. The silver Porsche in our driveway obviously belonged to Rachel, which meant she was physically present. In my bedroom with my husband, engaged in planning that extended far beyond the financial theft I had overheard. The violation was comprehensive, emotional, financial, and now physical, conducted in the home I had maintained and the bedroom I had shared with Marcus for over a decade. I moved through our house with deliberate silence, gathering essential items that would allow me to establish a temporary base of operations elsewhere while I developed a comprehensive response to Marcus's betrayal. My laptop, charging cables, the box of Aunt Vivian's estate documents, and a change of clothes went into a discreet overnight bag that would not suggest extended absence if Marcus noticed my departure. Most importantly, I retrieved the small, fireproof safe from my closet that contained our family's critical financial documents, including bank account information, investment records, and insurance policies that Marcus assumed I never reviewed or understood. The irony of this assumption would soon become apparent. While Marcus had spent 12 years convincing me that I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand complex financial instruments, I had maintained detailed records of our family's assets precisely because my doctoral training in behavioral economics had taught me the importance of documented evidence in analyzing decision-making patterns. The files Marcus dismissed as meaningless household paperwork actually represented a comprehensive database of our financial history that would provide the foundation for understanding exactly what he had stolen and how he had structured his theft to avoid detection. I left our house through the garage, using the remote access to open the door while starting my car simultaneously to minimize the duration of mechanical noise that might alert the upstairs occupants to my departure. As I backed out of our driveway, I could see the bedroom windows where Marcus and Rachel were presumably continuing their conversation about surgery funding and escape planning, completely unaware that their victim had discovered their scheme, and was beginning to formulate a response that would demonstrate the fatal flaw in their strategic thinking. The 20-minute drive to the Marriott in downtown Palo Alto provided essential time for initial emotional processing and preliminary, strategic analysis. The hotel represented neutral territory where I could think clearly without the psychological contamination of being surrounded by 12 years of marital memories and shared possessions that now felt tainted by Marcus's systematic deception. More practically, the hotel's business center would provide secure internet access and printing capabilities that I would need for the research and documentation phase of my response. After checking into a suite that would serve as my temporary command center, I spread Aunt Vivian's estate documents across the desk and began the process of understanding exactly what resources would be available to me in the coming battle with Marcus. What I discovered in those initial hours of review would transform my response from defensive protection of remaining assets to comprehensive strategic retaliation that would address not only my family's immediate needs, but also the broader implications of Marcus's betrayal for other potential victims. The inheritance documentation revealed that Aunt Vivian's estate planning had been extraordinarily sophisticated, reflecting not only her business acumen, but also her apparent understanding that I might one day need both financial resources and legal protection from circumstances she had been too diplomatic to discuss directly during her lifetime. The primary bequest consisted of $20 million in liquid assets that would transfer to my personal accounts within 48 hours of probate approval, but the estate structure included additional elements that suggested Vivian had been preparing for the possibility that I might face exactly the situation I was now confronting. Most significantly, the inheritance included controlling interest in 3 separate business entities that Vivian had established for specific strategic purposes. VivTech Holdings controlled a portfolio of technology investments worth an estimated $15 million, positioned to provide ongoing income while maintaining growth potential. Carmel Properties managed a collection of California real estate assets worth approximately $8 million, providing both stable rental income and potential liquidation options. Most intriguingly, Pacific Justice Fund represented a charitable foundation with a $50 million endowment dedicated to supporting women who had experienced financial fraud or domestic economic abuse. The documentation indicated that Vivian had been funding Pacific Justice Fund for over 5 years, providing legal representation, financial planning services, and emergency support for women whose spouses or partners had engaged in economic manipulation, theft, or fraud. The Foundation's case files, which I was authorized to review as the new controlling trustee, revealed dozens of situations remarkably similar to my own circumstances. Educated women whose confidence had been systematically undermined by manipulative partners who then exploited their victims' financial dependence to facilitate theft, abandonment, or other forms of economic abuse. Reading through these case studies during my first evening in the hotel, I began to understand that Marcus's treatment of me followed a recognizable pattern of behavior that predatory individuals use to create and exploit vulnerable targets. The systematic undermining of my intellectual confidence, the gradual assumption of complete financial control, the creation of legal documentation without my informed consent, and the theft of marital assets to fund relationships with other women represented standard tactics that had been used against numerous other victims with similar educational and professional backgrounds. This recognition was simultaneously devastating and empowering. Devastating because it revealed that my marriage had been based on manipulation tactics, rather than genuine affection or respect. Empowering because it meant that my situation was not unique, that other women had successfully overcome similar betrayals, and that Vivian had provided me with both the resources and the institutional framework to transform my personal crisis into broader advocacy that could prevent other women from experiencing the same exploitation. However, before I could consider longer-term implications, I needed to develop an immediate response to Marcus's theft and planned abandonment that would protect my children's financial security, while ensuring that he faced appropriate consequences for his betrayal. The strategic analysis that had once been my professional specialty would now be applied to the most personal and high-stakes situation of my life. My first priority was documenting the complete scope of Marcus's theft through comprehensive analysis of our family's financial records. Using the account information from our fireproof safe, I spent Saturday morning conducting detailed online research that revealed the true extent of the damage Marcus had inflicted on our financial security. The joint checking account showed a balance of $347, down from the typical monthly balance of $60,000 that covered our household expenses. The money market account had been completely emptied, eliminating $190,000 that represented our primary emergency fund. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had liquidated the children's education accounts, containing $430,000 accumulated over 14 years of monthly contributions and careful investment management. These funds had been specifically designated for Emma and Lucas's college expenses, protected by legal structures that should have required both parents' consent for any withdrawals. The fact that Marcus had successfully accessed these accounts suggested either forged documentation or legal authority that he had obtained through deceptive means. The investment accounts told an even more troubling story. Marcus had systematically liquidated positions worth over $200,000 during the past 6 months, using proceeds to fund what the transaction records described as real estate investments and business development expenses. Cross-referencing these transactions with Rachel's social media posts during the same period revealed a timeline of expensive dinners, luxury travel, and designer purchases that clearly represented Marcus using our family's money to finance his relationship with his mistress. Most concerning was the discovery that Marcus had obtained a home equity line of credit against our Palo Alto property without my knowledge or consent, borrowing $300,000 against the equity we had built over 12 years of mortgage payments. The loan documentation contained what appeared to be my signature, but I had no memory of signing these papers or being informed about this substantial increase in our debt obligations. By Saturday evening, my analysis revealed that Marcus had stolen or borrowed approximately $4 million from our family's assets, significantly more than the $875,000 he had mentioned to Rachel during their conversation. The additional funds had apparently been used to establish his new venture capital practice in Los Angeles, purchase luxury items for Rachel, and create a financial foundation for their planned life together. The scope of the theft was staggering, but equally significant was the sophistication of Marcus's methods. He had not simply written large checks or made obvious transfers that would immediately trigger my attention. Instead, he had used complex transaction structures, forged documents, and strategic timing to create a pattern of theft that might have remained undetected for months if I had not accidentally overheard his conversation with Rachel. This recognition led to a crucial strategic insight. Marcus's confidence in his scheme was based on the assumption that I would never discover his theft, and if I did discover it, I would lack the analytical skills to understand its full scope or respond effectively. His entire plan depended on my continued intellectual submission and financial dependence. By revealing my true capabilities and deploying the resources Vivian had provided, I could not only recover our stolen assets, but also ensure that Marcus faced consequences severe enough to deter similar behavior toward other potential victims. Sunday morning brought the phone call that would provide the final piece of information needed to complete my strategic analysis. Vivian's attorney, Patricia Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, contacted me to schedule the formal reading of the will and to provide preliminary information about the inheritance timeline and procedures. Sophia, I want you to understand that Vivian spent considerable time structuring this inheritance to provide you with maximum flexibility and protection, Patricia explained during our conversation. She was concerned about your marriage dynamics and wanted to ensure that you would have both the resources and the legal framework to handle any personal challenges that might arise. The phrasing suggested that Vivian had discussed her concerns about Marcus with her attorney, possibly providing specific instructions about protecting the inheritance from potential claims or interference by my husband. This possibility led me to ask directly about legal protections that might prevent Marcus from accessing or claiming rights to the inherited assets. The inheritance is structured as separate property with extensive legal protections against spousal claims, Patricia confirmed. Additionally, Vivian included specific instructions about providing emergency legal representation if you encounter any challenges related to domestic financial fraud or manipulation. She wanted to ensure that you would never be vulnerable to the kind of economic abuse that some women experience during marriage or divorce proceedings. Economic abuse. The term precisely described what Marcus had been doing to me for 12 years, and what he was now attempting to escalate through systematic theft and planned abandonment. Vivian had not only provided me with financial resources, but had also anticipated the exact nature of the challenge I was facing, and had created legal frameworks specifically designed to address economic manipulation by exploitative spouses. The inheritance would be available within 48 hours, providing me with $20 million in liquid assets, plus controlling interests in business entities worth an additional $73 million. More importantly, the inheritance included access to legal teams, financial advisors, and investigative resources that had been pre-selected for their expertise in addressing domestic economic fraud and protecting victims of financial manipulation. Marcus thought he was stealing money from a financially naive wife who would be helpless to respond effectively to his betrayal. He was actually stealing from someone who was about to have access to nearly $100 million in assets and professional resources, specifically designed to combat exactly the type of fraud he was perpetrating. The strategic framework for my response was becoming clear. Phase 1 would involve securing complete documentation of Marcus's theft and establishing legal protection for the remaining marital assets. Phase 2 would focus on recovering the stolen funds while ensuring that Marcus faced appropriate legal consequences for his fraud. Phase 3 would involve using the Pacific Justice Fund to address the broader pattern of economic abuse that Marcus's behavior represented, potentially helping other women who had experienced similar exploitation. However, the most important element of my strategy was psychological rather than financial. Marcus had built his scheme on the assumption that I was intellectually incapable of understanding complex financial transactions or developing sophisticated responses to his betrayal. By demonstrating analytical capabilities that exceeded his own strategic thinking, I would not only recover our stolen assets, but also destroy the foundation of manipulative assumptions that he used to exploit women who trusted him. The woman Marcus thought was too simple to balance a checkbook was about to demonstrate financial analysis, strategic planning, and tactical execution that would outmaneuver a venture capital professional who commanded multi-million-dollar investment funds. The transformation from victim to strategist was accelerating, and Marcus had provided exactly the motivation needed to ensure that his education would be both comprehensive and permanent. The strategic response was formulated. The resources were identified and secured. The legal framework was established. Marcus Chen was about to discover that his most successful manipulation had created his most formidable opponent, and that the woman he had taught to doubt her intelligence possessed capabilities that would transform his confident theft into a catastrophic miscalculation that would protect other women from experiencing similar betrayals. The foundation for justice had been laid. The tactical implementation was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the weight of transformation, settling onto my shoulders like armor I had forgotten how to wear. The transition from shocked victim to strategic analyst had occurred with startling rapidity over the weekend, but implementing my carefully formulated plan would require navigating obstacles that tested not only my revived analytical capabilities, but also my courage to act decisively when the stakes included my children's financial security and my own future independence. The first challenge emerged before I had finished my morning coffee in the hotel business center. Marcus had sent 3 increasingly urgent text messages inquiring about my whereabouts, ostensibly concerned about my failure to return home Sunday evening as expected. His messages revealed the first crack in his confident assumptions about my predictable behavior patterns, and more importantly, suggested that my absence had disrupted whatever timeline he and Rachel had established for their planned escape. "Sophia, I'm getting worried. You haven't responded to my calls, and Emma said you never picked her up from debate practice yesterday. Where are you?" The first message, sent at 11:47 p.m. Sunday, carried a tone of manufactured concern that masked what I recognized as anxiety about potential complications to his carefully orchestrated scheme. "This isn't like you to disappear without explanation. Please call me immediately so I know you're safe. The kids are asking questions I don't know how to answer." The second message, arriving at 6:23 a.m. Monday, revealed that my children were aware of my absence and were seeking explanations that Marcus was unprepared to provide without exposing his own deceptions. "Sophia, I'm calling your sister and your mother to see if they've heard from you. If something has happened to you, I need to know immediately." The third message, sent just 20 minutes before I read it, contained an implicit threat disguised as concern. Marcus was escalating his search efforts in ways that could potentially expose my investigation if I did not carefully manage the information available to him. The challenge was complex. I needed to maintain Marcus's confidence in his scheme while preventing him from discovering my knowledge of his theft or my preparations for retaliation. However, I also needed to protect my children from unnecessary anxiety while ensuring they remained safe during the increasingly volatile period leading up to Marcus's planned abandonment of our family. My response required strategic deception that balanced multiple objectives simultaneously. I composed a carefully worded text message that would reassure Marcus about my continued availability while providing legitimate explanations for my absence that would not trigger additional suspicion about my activities. "Marcus, I'm so sorry for the communication gap. Aunt Vivian's estate situation became complicated over the weekend, and I had to stay in Carmel an extra day to handle urgent legal matters. I'm still dealing with executor responsibilities but should be home by Wednesday evening. Can you handle the kids' schedules until then? I'll explain everything when I return." The message accomplished several strategic objectives. It provided a legitimate explanation for my absence that Marcus could verify through public records, showing Vivian's recent death and the probate proceedings that would naturally require executor attention. It established a timeline that would give me additional days to complete critical research and legal preparations before returning to direct contact with Marcus. Most importantly, it reinforced Marcus's perception of me as someone overwhelmed by complex legal and financial matters that were beyond my comfortable understanding. However, within 30 minutes of sending my response, I received a phone call that revealed the first serious obstacle to my strategic planning. Emma was calling from her cell phone during her lunch break at school, her voice carrying the anxiety that confirmed Marcus had not been entirely successful in reassuring our children about my sudden absence. "Mom, where are you really?" Emma asked with the directness that had made her an exceptional debate team member. "Dad said you're handling legal stuff for Aunt Vivian, but Sarah's mom is an estate attorney, and she said most probate issues can be handled remotely or with brief meetings. It doesn't make sense that you would need to stay away for multiple days." My 14-year-old daughter was demonstrating analytical thinking that threatened to expose the deception I was using to protect both my investigation and her own emotional well-being during this crisis period. Emma had inherited intellectual capabilities that made her naturally suspicious of explanations that did not align with logical expectations, and she possessed enough independence to conduct her own research when adults provided unsatisfactory answers to legitimate questions. The conversation required delicate navigation that would address Emma's concerns without revealing information that could compromise my strategic position or expose her to emotional trauma that she was not yet prepared to handle. More immediately, I needed to ensure that Emma did not share her suspicions with Marcus in ways that might alert him to potential problems with his assumptions about my activities and capabilities. Emma, you're absolutely right that most estate matters can be handled remotely, I acknowledged, respecting her analytical thinking while providing additional information that would satisfy her logical concerns. However, Aunt Vivian's situation is unusually complex because she owned multiple businesses and had extensive charitable commitments that require immediate attention. I'm also discovering that she named me as trustee for several foundations that have urgent deadlines this week. The explanation was technically accurate based on my weekend review of Vivian's estate documents, and it provided Emma with information that aligned with her understanding of how complex business matters might require extended personal attention. More importantly, it demonstrated respect for her analytical capabilities rather than dismissing her concerns with patronizing reassurances that would have increased her suspicions. "Is Dad taking good care of you and Lucas while I'm handling these responsibilities?" I asked, shifting the conversation toward information that would help me understand how Marcus was managing the household situation during my absence. "Dad? Seems really distracted and keeps checking his phone constantly," Emma replied with the observational skills that made her an effective student and daughter. "He's making weird comments about how we might need to adjust our summer vacation plans and maybe consider changing schools next year. It feels like he's preparing us for some kind of major life change, but he won't explain what he's talking about." Emma's observations confirmed that Marcus was beginning to prepare our children for the family disruption he was planning. But he was doing so through vague suggestions, rather than direct explanations that would reveal his intentions. This approach suggested that he was still confident in his timeline and had not yet recognized any threats to his carefully orchestrated scheme. However, Emma's awareness of unusual behavior patterns meant that my children would be observing and analyzing family dynamics with increasing attention during the critical period when I needed to complete my preparations without alerting Marcus to my knowledge of his plans. The challenge would be protecting my strategic position while ensuring that Emma and Lucas remained emotionally secure, despite the mounting tension surrounding them. After concluding my conversation with Emma, I spent Monday afternoon conducting the most challenging phase of my investigation, documenting Marcus's theft through comprehensive financial analysis that would provide legally admissible evidence of his fraudulent activities. This process required accessing account records, transaction histories, and legal documents that would demonstrate both the scope of his theft and the sophisticated methods he had used to conceal his activities. The technical aspects of this investigation revealed capabilities that I had not exercised since my graduate school research, but that returned with surprising fluency as I applied analytical frameworks to the personal financial data that would determine my family's future security. Each transaction pattern told a story about Marcus's strategic thinking, his relationship with Rachel, and his timeline for abandoning our marriage that provided crucial intelligence for developing effective countermeasures. However, the emotional aspects of this investigation proved far more challenging than the technical analysis. Every document revealed additional layers of deception that forced me to confront the reality that my marriage had been fundamentally dishonest for an extended period, possibly years longer than I had initially understood. The systematic nature of Marcus's theft suggested planning and preparation that predated his relationship with Rachel, indicating that he had been viewing our marriage as a source of financial resources rather than a genuine partnership, long before I had any awareness of problems in our relationship. The most devastating discovery came through analysis of credit card records that revealed Marcus had been funding relationships with multiple women during our marriage, not just Rachel. Hotel charges, restaurant expenses, and luxury purchases formed patterns that suggested serial infidelity, conducted with our family's money over a period spanning at least 3 years. Rachel appeared to be simply the most recent and most expensive of Marcus's extramarital relationships, not the unique romantic connection that had motivated his betrayal of our marriage vows. This recognition was simultaneously crushing and liberating, Crushing because it revealed that my marriage had been based on deception far more extensive than I had initially understood. Liberating because it confirmed that Marcus's betrayal was not motivated by genuine romantic passion that might have been understandable, but rather by manipulative behavior patterns that represented a fundamental character deficiency that made him unsuitable for any committed relationship. By Monday evening, my investigation had documented theft totaling $67 million when including the home equity loan proceeds that Marcus had diverted to personal accounts without my knowledge. The evidence was comprehensive and legally admissible, providing the foundation for both criminal charges and civil recovery actions that would ensure Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his fraud while protecting my children's financial future. However, the most significant development of Monday came through my afternoon conversation with Patricia Chen, Vivian's attorney, who confirmed that the inheritance transfers had been completed and that $20 million was now available in my personal accounts. More importantly, Patricia provided information about the legal resources Vivian had prepared specifically for situations involving domestic financial fraud. Sophia, I want you to understand that Vivian anticipated you might face exactly this type of situation, Patricia explained during our secure phone conversation. She retained a team of specialists who handle complex cases involving economic abuse and domestic fraud. They have been briefed on your inheritance structure and are prepared to assist immediately if you need comprehensive legal and investigative support. The team included forensic accountants who specialized in tracing stolen assets through complex transaction structures, family law attorneys with expertise in protecting victims of economic abuse, and private investigators who focused on documenting fraudulent behavior by manipulative spouses. Most importantly, the team operated through the Pacific Justice Fund structure that provided complete confidentiality while ensuring that their services were available without any financial cost to victims of domestic economic abuse. There's something else you should know, Patricia continued. Vivian specifically instructed me to inform you that the Pacific Justice Fund has handled several cases involving venture capital professionals who used their expertise to exploit spouses and business partners. We have developed specialized strategies for addressing the unique challenges that arise when the perpetrator possesses sophisticated financial knowledge and industry connections. This information revealed that Vivian had not only anticipated my specific situation, but had also researched the tactics that professionals like Marcus used to exploit their victims and had developed countermeasures specifically designed to address those sophisticated forms of fraud. The inheritance was not simply money, but a comprehensive support system designed to ensure that educated women with manipulative spouses would have access to resources and expertise that matched or exceeded their abusers' capabilities. Tuesday morning brought the first direct test of my strategic planning when Marcus called to inform me that he would be traveling to Los Angeles for unexpected business meetings that would require him to be out of town Wednesday through Friday. The timing aligned perfectly with the conversation I had overheard between Marcus and Rachel about their planned departure, confirming that he was accelerating his timeline and beginning the final phase of his escape plan. Sophia, I know the timing is terrible with you handling Vivian's estate matters, but this opportunity came up suddenly and could be crucial for expanding my fund's Los Angeles presence, Marcus explained with the tone of manufactured regret, that I now recognized as a characteristic element of his deceptive communication style. The irony was profound. Marcus was announcing his departure to establish a new life with his mistress, while presenting it as a business opportunity that would benefit our family's financial future. His confidence in my continued ignorance was so complete that he was essentially describing his abandonment while expecting my supportive understanding of his professional advancement. Of course, you should pursue important business opportunities, I replied, matching his tone while recognizing that his absence would provide optimal conditions for implementing the next phase of my strategic response. I should be finished with the estate matters by Wednesday evening, so the timing actually works well for both of us. My response accomplished two critical objectives. It maintained Marcus's confidence in my continued support and ignorance, while positioning me to begin legal and financial actions during his absence that would ensure he returned to discover consequences he had never anticipated. By Thursday morning, Marcus would learn that his financially naive wife possessed capabilities that had transformed his apparent success into a comprehensive strategic failure. The first tests were complete. My analytical capabilities had proven equal to the complex investigation required to document Marcus's fraud. My strategic thinking had successfully navigated the initial challenges of protecting my position while gathering essential intelligence. Most importantly, my emotional resilience had survived the devastating recognition that my marriage had been based on systematic deception and exploitation. The woman Marcus thought was too intellectually limited to understand his sophisticated theft was about to demonstrate planning and execution that would outmaneuver a venture capital professional who had commanded multi-million-dollar investment funds. The foundation for justice had been established. The evidence had been gathered. The resources had been secured. The tactical implementation was about to begin, and Marcus had unknowingly provided the perfect opportunity for his education about the true capabilities of the woman he had so systematically underestimated. Wednesday morning marked the beginning of the most decisive 48 hours of my adult life. As Marcus departed for Los Angeles with his fabricated business meetings serving as cover for establishing his new life with Rachel, I was simultaneously implementing the most sophisticated strategic response that my revived analytical capabilities and Vivian's carefully planned resources could produce. The woman he had systematically taught to doubt her intelligence was about to demonstrate tactical execution that would transform his confident escape into a comprehensive strategic failure. The first order of business was establishing my command center in the downtown San Francisco offices of Whitney, Morrison & Associates, the premier family law firm that specialized in complex divorce cases involving high-asset couples and sophisticated financial fraud. Patricia Chen had arranged for me to meet with the firm's senior partner, Catherine Whitney, whose reputation for protecting victims of domestic economic abuse had made her the attorney of choice for Silicon Valley wives facing exactly my circumstances. Walking into Whitney's corner office overlooking the financial district, I experienced a profound psychological shift that marked the completion of my transformation from victim to strategic actor. For 12 years, I had entered professional environments as Marcus's wife, my identity defined by his achievements, and my role limited to social support for his business relationships. Today, I entered as Sophia Chen, heir to a $93 million estate, controlling trustee of a major charitable foundation, and the primary decision-maker in legal proceedings that would determine my family's future. Catherine Whitney possessed the combination of intellectual sharpness and emotional intelligence that made her exceptionally effective at helping intelligent women navigate the complex challenges of divorce from manipulative spouses. Her initial assessment of my situation revealed strategic thinking that immediately validated my decision to work with Vivian's pre-selected legal team, rather than attempting to handle Marcus's betrayal through conventional approaches. Sophia, based on the financial analysis you have provided and the evidence of systematic fraud you have documented, we are dealing with a case that extends far beyond traditional marital infidelity, Catherine explained during our initial consultation. Marcus has committed multiple felonies including identity theft, wire fraud, and money laundering. More importantly, his sophisticated methods suggest this behavior represents a pattern that likely extends to other relationships and business dealings. This assessment aligned with my own analysis, but provided the additional perspective of someone who had handled dozens of similar cases involving educated women whose spouses had exploited their trust and financial dependence. Catherine's experience revealed that Marcus's behavior followed recognizable patterns that could be predicted and countered, using established legal strategies that had proven effective against similarly manipulative individuals. Our immediate priorities are threefold, Catherine continued. Outlining a tactical framework that demonstrated the comprehensive approach Vivian had anticipated would be necessary for my situation. First, we need to secure all remaining marital assets and prevent additional theft during the period before Marcus realizes his scheme has been discovered. Second, we need to file criminal charges that will ensure he faces appropriate legal consequences for his fraud. Third, we need to position your divorce proceedings to maximize asset recovery while protecting your inheritance from any potential claims. The legal strategy Catherine proposed was elegant in its comprehensiveness. Rather than simply responding to Marcus's theft, we would be proactively addressing every aspect of his betrayal while ensuring that my children's financial security was protected and enhanced beyond what would have been possible before his fraudulent activities provided legal justification for aggressive asset recovery actions. However, the most satisfying element of our strategy was psychological rather than legal. Marcus had built his entire scheme on assumptions about my intellectual limitations and emotional dependence that would be systematically disproven through our tactical implementation. Each phase of our response would demonstrate capabilities that exceeded his own strategic thinking, while revealing that his greatest victim possessed resources and planning skills that made his apparent success temporary and ultimately self-defeating. The first phase of implementation began Wednesday afternoon with coordinated actions across multiple jurisdictions that would secure evidence, protect assets, and establish legal proceedings before Marcus had any awareness that his scheme had been discovered. The sophistication of this coordination reflected both Catherine's experience and the specialized resources that Vivian had made available through the Pacific Justice Fund. At exactly 2 p.m. Pacific Time, while Marcus was presumably meeting with Rachel in Los Angeles to finalize their escape plans, court orders were being filed in Santa Clara County that would freeze all marital assets, prevent additional transfers from joint accounts, and establish legal protection for the children's educational funds that Marcus had stolen. Simultaneously, forensic accountants were beginning comprehensive audits of Marcus's business accounts, investment portfolios, and credit facilities that would trace every dollar he had stolen and identify additional fraudulent activities that my individual investigation might have missed. Most importantly, criminal complaints were being filed with both the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division that would ensure Marcus faced felony charges for identity, theft, wire fraud, and money laundering related to his systematic theft of marital assets. These charges carried potential sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison, consequences that would serve both as appropriate punishment for his crimes and as deterrent examples for other individuals who might consider similar exploitation of vulnerable spouses. The coordination required for this multi-jurisdictional response revealed capabilities that I had not possessed as an individual, but that became available through Vivian's carefully planned support systems. The Pacific Justice Fund maintained relationships with law enforcement agencies, prosecutorial offices, and regulatory bodies that specialized in domestic economic abuse cases, enabling rapid implementation of legal actions that might have required months of preparation if attempted through conventional approaches. However, the most personally satisfying development of Wednesday afternoon was the phone call I received from Detective Maria Santos of the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Economic Crimes Unit, who had been assigned to investigate Marcus's fraudulent activities. Detective Santos had reviewed the evidence I had provided and wanted to inform me that my investigation had been extraordinarily thorough and legally sophisticated. Ms. Chen, I want you to understand that your documentation and analysis of this fraud case is among the most comprehensive I have encountered in 15 years of investigating financial crimes, Detective Santos explained during our conversation. Your evidence will make prosecution straightforward, but more importantly, your analytical work has identified patterns that suggest your husband may have victimized other individuals through similar schemes. This recognition validated not only my revived analytical capabilities, but also the strategic decision to approach Marcus's betrayal as a complex fraud case, rather than simply a marital dispute. The intellectual skills that Marcus had convinced me to doubt had proven superior to his own planning abilities, and the comprehensive evidence I had gathered would ensure that his legal consequences reflected the true scope of his criminal behavior. Detective Santos also provided information that revealed additional dimensions of Marcus's fraudulent activities that my individual investigation had not uncovered. His business accounts showed patterns of suspicious transactions that suggested he had been stealing from investor funds as well as marital assets, potentially exposing him to additional federal charges that could result in decades of prison time rather than the shorter sentences associated with domestic fraud cases. We are coordinating with federal authorities and the Securities and Exchange Commission to investigate potential securities fraud related to your husband's venture capital activities, Detective Santos continued. If our preliminary findings are confirmed, he could face charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences of 25 years in federal prison. The implications were staggering. Marcus's theft of our family's money had apparently been part of a broader pattern of financial fraud that included stealing from the investors who had trusted him with their capital. His betrayal of our marriage represented just one element of systematic criminal behavior that had put dozens of individuals and families at financial risk. This recognition transformed my perspective on the justice I was seeking. Rather than simply recovering stolen marital assets, I was now participating in a comprehensive investigation that would protect multiple victims of Marcus's fraudulent schemes while ensuring that his criminal behavior faced consequences severe enough to prevent similar exploitation of other vulnerable individuals. Thursday morning brought the first tangible evidence that our strategic implementation was succeeding beyond my initial expectations. The forensic accounting team had identified over $2 million in recoverable assets that Marcus had hidden in various accounts, investment vehicles, and business entities that he had established, using stolen funds. More importantly, they had traced the specific transactions that documented his theft of our children's education funds, providing evidence that would support both criminal charges and civil recovery actions that would restore Emma and Lucas's college savings with substantial additional damages. However, the most significant development was the discovery that Marcus had been planning his escape for over 18 months, far longer than I had initially understood based on his conversation with Rachel. Account records revealed that he had been systematically transferring money to offshore accounts and establishing business entities in non-extradition jurisdictions as early as January of the previous year, indicating that his betrayal of our marriage had been planned and implemented over an extended period rather than representing a sudden decision motivated by his relationship with Rachel. This timeline revealed that Marcus's systematic undermining of my intellectual confidence had served a strategic purpose beyond simply maintaining domestic control. By convincing me that I was incapable of understanding complex financial matters, he had created conditions that allowed him to implement sophisticated theft over an extended period without detection or interference. His manipulation had been designed specifically to facilitate the fraudulent activities that would fund his planned abandonment of our family. The recognition was simultaneously devastating and empowering. Devastating because it confirmed that our entire marriage had been compromised by his fraudulent intentions for a significant period. Empowering because it revealed that my analytical capabilities had been sufficient to uncover and document criminal behavior that had been planned and concealed by someone with professional expertise in financial analysis and strategic planning. Thursday afternoon brought communication from Marcus that confirmed he had no awareness of the legal actions that were systematically dismantling his criminal scheme, while he believed he was successfully implementing his escape plan. His text message to me was casual and confident, reporting successful meetings in Los Angeles and expressing anticipation about returning home Friday evening to begin preparing for what he described as exciting new opportunities for our family. The disconnect between Marcus's confident communication and the reality that he would return to face arrest warrants, frozen assets, and comprehensive evidence of his criminal activities was profound. His apparent success was actually facilitating his complete strategic failure and his confidence in my continued ignorance was enabling legal actions that would ensure he faced maximum consequences for his betrayal. However, the most personally meaningful development of Thursday was the phone call I received from Emma, who had apparently been observing family dynamics with increasing analytical sophistication during my absence and Marcus's recent behavioral changes. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly," Emma said with the intellectual courage that made her exceptional as both a student and a daughter. "Is Dad planning to leave us? Because his behavior this week suggests he is preparing for major life changes that he has not discussed with you or explained to Lucas and me." Emma's question forced me to confront the challenge of protecting my children's emotional well-being while acknowledging their right to understand the situation that would affect their future security and family relationships. Her analytical abilities meant that deceptive reassurances would be ineffective and potentially damaging to our relationship, but complete disclosure would expose her to emotional trauma that she was not prepared to handle. "Emma, I want you to know that whatever changes occur in our family situation, your security and Lucas's security will be completely protected," I replied, providing reassurance about her primary concerns while acknowledging that changes were indeed occurring. "I have discovered that Dad has been making financial and personal decisions that affect our family without discussing them with me, and I am working with legal professionals to ensure that you and Lucas are protected regardless of what Dad ultimately decides about his own future." The conversation required delicate navigation that balanced honesty with age-appropriate protection, but Emma's response revealed that she possessed both the intellectual maturity and emotional resilience to handle the uncertainty while trusting my capability to manage the crisis effectively. "Mom, you sound different than you have in years," Emma observed with insight that surprised me with its accuracy. "You sound like the person I remember from when I was younger, before you started asking Dad's permission for everything and claiming you did not understand financial concepts that you obviously comprehended better than most adults." Emma's recognition that I had been systematically diminishing my intellectual capabilities provided confirmation that the transformation I was experiencing represented a return to authentic competence rather than sudden development of new abilities. My children had observed my gradual submission to Marcus's manipulation and were now witnessing my reclamation of intellectual confidence and strategic thinking skills that had never actually disappeared. By Thursday evening, as I prepared for Marcus's return and the confrontation that would reveal his complete strategic failure, I realized that the momentum I had built over the past week represented more than successful tactical implementation. It represented the reconstruction of my professional identity, the reclamation of analytical capabilities that had been suppressed but never destroyed, and the development of strategic thinking skills that exceeded anything I had possessed before. Marriage convinced me to abandon my intellectual ambitions. The woman Marcus thought was too simple to understand. Complex financial portfolios had demonstrated investigative and analytical capabilities that exceeded the strategic planning skills of a venture capital professional who commanded multi-million-dollar investment funds. The wife he had trained to seek his approval had coordinated legal and financial actions across multiple jurisdictions that would ensure he faced consequences for criminal behavior he had believed would never be discovered or understood. Marcus. Chen was about to return from Los Angeles expecting to find his financially dependent wife, waiting for explanations about his business success and future family opportunities. Instead, he would discover that his most successful manipulation had created his most formidable opponent, and that the woman he had taught to doubt her intelligence possessed capabilities that had transformed his apparent triumph into a comprehensive, strategic failure that would serve as a cautionary example for anyone who might consider similar exploitation of vulnerable partners. The momentum was building. The foundation for justice was complete. The tactical implementation had exceeded all expectations. Marcus's education about the true capabilities of the woman he had so systematically underestimated was about to begin, and the lessons would be both comprehensive and permanent. Friday evening arrived with the deceptive calm that precedes the most violent storms. As Marcus's flight from Los Angeles touched down at San Francisco International Airport, I was sitting in our Palo Alto living room with the complete documentation of his criminal activities spread across the coffee table and the confidence that comes from having spent 4 days implementing legal strategies that would ensure his fraudulent scheme faced comprehensive consequences. However, the next 6 hours would test whether my revived analytical capabilities and strategic planning skills were sufficient to handle an opponent whose desperation would transform him from a confident manipulator into a cornered criminal, willing to escalate his threats in ways I had not anticipated. Marcus arrived home at 8:23 p.m., his demeanor reflecting the satisfaction of someone who believed his Los Angeles meetings had successfully established the foundation for his new life with Rachel. His casual confidence as he entered our house, kissed my cheek with practiced affection, and began describing his fabricated business opportunities, revealed that he had no awareness of the legal actions that had systematically dismantled his criminal enterprise during his absence. Sophia, the Los Angeles expansion meetings exceeded all my expectations, Marcus announced with enthusiasm that would have been touching if I had not known about his actual activities during the past 3 days. The investment opportunities, they're extraordinary, and I believe we should seriously consider relocating the family to take advantage of the professional growth potential. The irony was profound. Marcus was essentially describing his planned abandonment of our family while presenting it as a career opportunity that would benefit everyone. His confidence in my continued ignorance was so complete that he was providing details about his escape plan while expecting my supportive enthusiasm for his professional advancement. That sounds like an exciting opportunity, I replied, maintaining the persona of financial dependence and intellectual submission that had enabled me to gather comprehensive evidence of his criminal activities. However, before we discuss major life changes, I think we need to address some urgent financial matters that came up while you were traveling. I gestured toward the coffee table where the documentation of his theft was arranged in organized stacks that would demonstrate both the scope of his fraud and the analytical capabilities he had consistently underestimated. Marcus's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to confused concern as he recognized bank statements, transaction records, and legal documents that should have remained beyond my understanding or access. "What kind of financial matters?" Marcus asked, his tone carrying the first hint of anxiety I had heard in his voice during our 12 years of marriage. "And why do you have all these account records spread out? You know that financial analysis gives you anxiety and usually results in misunderstandings about complex investment strategies." The systematic condescension in his response revealed how deeply his manipulation had become embedded in our communication patterns. Even when confronted with evidence of potential problems, Marcus's instinctive reaction was to reinforce my supposed intellectual limitations rather than addressing the substance of my concerns. His reflexive dismissiveness would prove to be a strategic error that provided additional evidence of the psychological manipulation he had used to facilitate his criminal activities. "Marcus, I need you to explain these transactions," I said, pointing to specific documentation that showed his systematic theft of our children's education funds. "According to these records, you liquidated Emma and Lucas's college savings accounts without my knowledge or consent. I also see transfers totaling over $800,000 from our joint accounts to personal accounts that I do not recognize." Marcus examined the documents for several moments, his expression revealing the internal calculations of someone determining how to respond to unexpected complications. His strategy became apparent as he shifted into the patronizing explanation mode that had been effective at undermining my confidence for over a decade. "Sophia, you are looking at sophisticated investment reallocation strategies that require complex understanding of tax implications and market timing," Marcus replied with the tone of patient condescension that I now recognized as calculated manipulation. "I moved the children's education funds into higher-yield investment vehicles that will generate superior returns over the next 10 years. The transfers you are questioning represent strategic portfolio diversification that will significantly increase our family's long-term financial security." His explanation was smooth and confident, delivered with the professional authority that had made him successful in venture capital negotiations. However, his response revealed that he was still operating under the assumption that technical complexity would intimidate me into accepting his explanations without independent verification or deeper investigation. Marcus, these documents show that the transferred funds were used to pay for luxury travel, expensive restaurants, and medical procedures for someone named Rachel Morrison, I replied, producing additional evidence that would demonstrate the true nature of his financial activities. I also have documentation showing that you established credit lines against our home equity without my knowledge, and used the proceeds to fund personal expenses that had nothing to do with investment strategies or our family's financial security. The introduction of Rachel's name and specific details about his personal spending created the first crack in Marcus's confident demeanor. His expression shifted from patronizing patience to genuine alarm as he realized that my investigation had uncovered information that went far beyond simple account balances or transfer amounts. "Sophia, where did you get this information?" Marcus demanded, his tone revealing anger that suggested he was beginning to understand the seriousness of his situation. "These are private business records that you have no legal right to access. And your interpretation of the transaction data is completely incorrect due to your lack of understanding about complex financial instruments." His response was revealing in multiple ways. First, he was acknowledging the accuracy of my evidence while claiming that I lacked the legal right to access information about my own family's finances. Second, he was escalating his dismissive comments about my intellectual capabilities in ways that confirmed the systematic nature of his psychological manipulation. Most importantly, he was becoming defensive and aggressive, rather than providing explanations that would address the substance of my accusations. "Marcus, I am not misinterpreting anything," I replied with the calm confidence that comes from having comprehensive evidence and professional legal support. "I know about your relationship with Rachel Morrison. I know about the plastic surgery you funded with our children's college savings. I know about your plans to relocate to Los Angeles and abandon our family. Most importantly, I know that you have committed multiple felonies including identity theft, wire fraud, and money laundering that will result in criminal charges regardless of any explanations you might offer." The reference to criminal charges created an immediate transformation in Marcus's demeanor from defensive anger to genuine fear. His face lost color as he processed the implications of my statement, and his voice carried a tremor that revealed his recognition that his carefully planned scheme had been comprehensively discovered and documented. "Sophia, you do not understand the legal complexities of what you are suggesting," Marcus said, his voice carrying desperation that replaced his previous confidence. "Moving money between family accounts is not criminal activity, and any perceived irregularities can be explained through proper financial planning documentation that you are not qualified to interpret correctly." However, his attempt to maintain his manipulation was interrupted by the doorbell ringing at exactly 9:15 p.m. Through our front window, I could see two individuals in professional attire who were clearly not social visitors making evening calls. Marcus's expression revealed that he recognized the implications of official visitors arriving during our confrontation about his criminal activities. "Marcus Chen?" the lead visitor asked when Marcus opened the door. "I am Detective Maria Santos with the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Economic Crimes Unit, and this is Special Agent Thompson from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have warrants for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft related to systematic theft of marital assets and investor funds." The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal precision of a carefully choreographed legal procedure that demonstrated the comprehensive nature of the case that had been built against Marcus during his confident absence in Los Angeles. Detective Santos read the charges while Special Agent Thompson secured the evidence that would be needed for prosecution. Marcus's expression shifted from shock to denial to desperate attempts at explanation that revealed his complete inability to comprehend how his apparent success had transformed into comprehensive strategic failure. This is obviously a misunderstanding based on my wife's misinterpretation of legitimate business transactions, Marcus protested as the handcuffs were applied. Sophia lacks the financial education to understand complex investment strategies, and her accusations are based on ignorance rather than actual criminal activity. His final attempt to dismiss my capabilities was delivered to law enforcement professionals who had reviewed the evidence I had provided and found it to be extraordinarily comprehensive and legally sophisticated. Detective Santos's response revealed the extent to which Marcus's assumptions about my intellectual limitations had been proven false. Mr. Chen, your wife's financial analysis and evidence documentation is among the most thorough I have encountered. In 15 years of investigating economic crimes, Detective Santos replied. Her investigation uncovered criminal activities that our own forensic accounting team confirmed through independent analysis. The charges you are facing are based on documented evidence that will make prosecution straightforward and conviction highly probable. As Marcus was escorted from our house in handcuffs, his final words to me revealed that he still could not accept the reality that his systematic undermining of my intellectual confidence had been completely unsuccessful in eliminating the analytical capabilities that had enabled me to destroy his criminal scheme. Sophia, you have no idea what you have done or how this will affect our children's future, Marcus called out as he was placed in the police vehicle. You are destroying our family based on misunderstandings that could have been resolved through proper communication and professional financial guidance. His parting message demonstrated that even when facing criminal charges supported by comprehensive evidence, Marcus remained committed to the belief that I was intellectually inferior and emotionally unstable. His inability to recognize my actual capabilities had been so fundamental to his worldview that legal arrest could not force him to acknowledge the strategic thinking skills that had dismantled his fraudulent activities. However, Marcus's arrest represented only the beginning of the major obstacle that would test whether my transformation was sufficiently deep to handle the complex challenges that would emerge over the following weeks. Within hours of his detention, I received phone calls that revealed Marcus had retained one of San Francisco's most aggressive criminal defense attorneys, someone whose reputation for protecting wealthy clients facing white-collar crime charges suggested that the legal battle was far from over. More immediately concerning was the phone call I received Saturday morning from Marcus's business partner, David Kim, who informed me that Marcus's arrest was creating catastrophic problems for their venture capital fund that would potentially affect dozens of investor families and portfolio companies that had relied on Marcus's financial management and strategic guidance. Sophia, I need you to understand that Marcus's legal problems are creating a crisis that extends far beyond your family situation, David explained with obvious distress. Our fund manages over $200 million in investor capital, and Marcus's arrest has triggered panic among our investors who are demanding immediate explanations and account audits. If we cannot stabilize the situation quickly, the entire fund could collapse and destroy the financial security of families who trusted us with their retirement savings and children's educational funds. This information revealed a dimension of Marcus's criminal behavior that my individual investigation had not fully understood. His theft of our family's assets had apparently been part of broader fraudulent activities that involved stealing from investor funds as well as marital accounts. The criminal charges he was facing represented not only justice for his betrayal of our marriage, but also protection for dozens of other families who had unknowingly become victims of his systematic fraud. However, David's explanation also revealed a complication that threatened to transform my victory into a devastating obstacle. Several investors were demanding that Marcus be released immediately so he could provide explanations and documentation that would allow them to recover their investments. They were arguing that criminal prosecution would delay recovery efforts and potentially force their families into financial crisis through no fault of their own. Sophia, I am asking you to consider withdrawing the criminal charges and pursuing civil remedies instead, David continued with increasing desperation. Marcus's continued detention will destroy dozens of families who have nothing to do with your marital problems, but who will lose their life savings if our fund collapses due to his unavailability to manage investor relations and portfolio companies. The request represented the most difficult ethical challenge I had faced since discovering Marcus's betrayal. The criminal charges were appropriate consequences for his fraudulent behavior and necessary to prevent him from victimizing other women through similar schemes. However, maintaining those charges might destroy the financial security of innocent families whose only connection to Marcus was their trust in his professional competence and ethical standards. The dilemma was profound and personal. My transformation from victim to strategic actor had been motivated by the desire to protect my children's financial future, while ensuring that Marcus faced consequences that would deter similar exploitation of vulnerable women. However, success in those objectives might require sacrificing the financial security of other families who had become unwitting victims of Marcus's criminal activities. The major obstacle was not external resistance to my strategic planning, but rather the internal challenge of determining whether justice required prosecuting Marcus regardless of collateral damage to innocent victims, or whether protecting those victims required compromising the consequences that might prevent future exploitation of vulnerable spouses by manipulative partners. The woman who had reclaimed her analytical capabilities and demonstrated strategic thinking skills that exceeded Marcus's own planning abilities, now faced a decision that would test whether her transformation was sufficiently deep to handle complex, ethical challenges that had no clear solutions and significant consequences regardless of the choice she made. The foundation for justice had been established, but the final test would determine whether that foundation was strong enough to support decisions that balanced personal vindication against broader social responsibility. The major obstacle was not Marcus's resistance or legal complications, but rather the recognition that true strategic thinking required considering consequences that extended far beyond individual satisfaction to encompass the welfare of all individuals affected by the decisions she would make in the coming weeks. The weekend following Marcus's arrest passed in a blur of phone calls, emergency meetings, and ethical deliberations that would test whether my transformation from submissive spouse to strategic leader was sufficiently complete to handle decisions that carried consequences extending far beyond my personal vindication. As I sat in Catherine Whitney's office Sunday morning, surrounded by legal documents and financial analyses that detailed the scope of Marcus's criminal activities, I faced a choice that would define not only my future, but also the financial security of dozens of families who had unknowingly become victims of my husband's systematic fraud. The complexity of the situation had become clear through intensive investigation over the past 48 hours. Marcus's theft of our family's assets represented only a portion of a much larger scheme that had systematically defrauded investors in his venture capital fund through sophisticated embezzlement techniques that had diverted over $12 million from legitimate investment accounts to personal spending and fraudulent business ventures. The criminal charges he was facing were appropriate and necessary, but his continued detention was creating a crisis that threatened to destroy the financial security of innocent families whose retirement savings and children's educational funds were trapped in accounts that could not be accessed without his cooperation. "Sophia, I want you to understand the full scope of what we are dealing with," Catherine explained as she reviewed the comprehensive analysis prepared by the forensic accounting team over the weekend. "Marcus has stolen approximately $167 million from your family's assets, but he has also embezzled over $12 million from investor funds that belong to 63 different families. These investors include teachers, small business owners, and retirees whose entire financial security is tied up in accounts that Marcus controlled and systematically looted over the past 18 months. The revelation was devastating in its implications. My husband had not simply betrayed our marriage and stolen our children's educational funds. He had operated a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had defrauded dozens of families who had trusted him with their life savings based on his reputation for financial expertise and ethical business practices. His theft had extended far beyond our marital assets to encompass the retirement security of people who had worked for decades to build modest wealth that Marcus had systematically stolen for personal use. "What are the practical options for recovering the stolen investor funds?" I asked, recognizing that my decision about criminal prosecution would directly affect whether innocent families could recover their stolen assets or face financial ruin through no fault of their own. Catherine's response revealed the complexity of the situation and the difficult trade-offs that any course of action would require. If Marcus remains in criminal detention, the investor funds will likely be frozen in legal proceedings for 18 to 24 months while prosecutors build their case and defense attorneys challenge evidence and jurisdiction. During that period, the affected families will have no access to their money, which could force many of them into bankruptcy or prevent them from meeting urgent financial obligations like medical expenses or educational costs. The alternative was equally problematic from a justice perspective. If Marcus were released on bail and allowed to cooperate with recovery efforts, he could potentially help locate and return stolen funds more quickly, but his release would also provide opportunities for him to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or potentially flee the country to avoid prosecution. More troubling from my personal standpoint, his release would signal that wealthy individuals could avoid immediate consequences for criminal behavior if their cooperation was needed to protect their victims from additional harm. However, there is a third option that might address both the need for justice and the urgency of victim protection, Catherine continued, outlining a strategy that would require deploying the full scope of resources that Vivian's inheritance had made available. The Pacific Justice Fund has sufficient capital to immediately compensate all affected investors for their losses, essentially buying their claims against Marcus and taking over responsibility for recovering the stolen funds through civil and criminal proceedings. This approach would provide immediate relief for innocent victims while ensuring that Marcus faces full legal consequences for his criminal behavior. The strategy was elegant in its comprehensiveness, but it would require me to commit approximately $15 million of Vivian's inheritance to compensating victims of Marcus's fraud before any certainty about recovering those funds through legal proceedings. The decision would transform my personal crisis into a broader advocacy initiative that would protect dozens of families while demonstrating that economic abuse victims could become powerful advocates for other vulnerable individuals. The compensation approach offers several strategic advantages beyond victim protection, Catherine explained as we reviewed the detailed implementation plan. First, it removes the urgency that defense attorneys are using to argue for Marcus's release and creates conditions where criminal prosecution can proceed without time pressure from desperate investors. Second, it establishes your credibility as someone committed to justice rather than personal revenge, which will strengthen your position in divorce proceedings and custody determinations. Most importantly, it demonstrates the kind of leadership that transforms personal trauma into broader social change. The psychological dimension of this decision was perhaps more significant than the financial implications. By choosing to use Vivian's inheritance to protect Marcus's victims, rather than simply pursuing personal vindication, I would be completing my transformation from someone who had been systematically manipulated and exploited into someone who possessed the resources and strategic thinking necessary to prevent similar exploitation of other vulnerable individuals. However, the decision also carried substantial risks that could not be ignored. If Marcus had hidden assets more successfully than our investigation had discovered, or if legal proceedings failed to recover stolen funds, I could lose a significant portion of Vivian's inheritance while Marcus escaped with substantial resources that would enable him to continue exploiting other victims in the future. The strategy required not only financial commitment, but also confidence in my analytical capabilities and legal team's effectiveness that would be tested over months or years of complex litigation. As I considered the magnitude of this decision, I realized that it represented the ultimate test of whether my transformation had been sufficiently deep to handle responsibilities that extended far beyond personal and family interests. The woman Marcus had systematically taught to doubt her intelligence was being asked to make strategic decisions involving millions of dollars and the financial security of dozens of families. The success or failure of my choice would demonstrate whether the analytical capabilities I had reclaimed were sufficient for leadership roles that carried consequences for multiple communities of affected individuals. "Catherine, I want to proceed with the victim compensation strategy," I announced after 30 minutes of contemplation that had reviewed every aspect of the decision and its potential consequences. The Pacific Justice Fund will provide immediate compensation to all affected investors, and we will pursue comprehensive legal action to recover every dollar Marcus stole while ensuring he faces maximum criminal consequences for his fraudulent activities. The decision represented a point of no return in my transformation. By committing $15 million to protect Marcus's victims, I was accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond my personal situation and demonstrating leadership capabilities that Marcus had convinced me did not exist. The woman who had been taught to seek approval for $500 purchases was deploying resources worth more than most people's lifetime earnings to address systematic financial fraud that had affected multiple communities. However, the most profound aspect of this decision was psychological rather than financial. By choosing to protect others rather than maximizing my personal recovery, I was rejecting the victim identity that Marcus's manipulation had created and embracing a leadership role that would define my future contributions to protecting vulnerable individuals from economic abuse and financial exploitation. "Sophia, I want you to understand what you have just committed to accomplish," Catherine said as we began implementing the victim compensation strategy. "You are not simply recovering from personal betrayal or seeking individual justice. You are creating a model for how economic abuse victims can become powerful advocates for systemic change that protects other vulnerable individuals from experiencing similar exploitation." The implementation required coordination across multiple legal jurisdictions and financial institutions that would test every aspect of the support systems Vivian had created through the Pacific Justice Fund. Over the next 72 hours, legal teams would be negotiating with 63 different investor families to establish compensation agreements that would provide immediate financial relief while preserving legal claims against Marcus. Simultaneously, forensic accountants would be tracing stolen assets across domestic and international accounts to maximize recovery possibilities, while ensuring that Marcus faced criminal charges that reflected the full scope of his fraudulent activities. Most importantly, the victim compensation strategy would be implemented with complete transparency and professional oversight that would demonstrate the accountability and strategic thinking necessary to transform personal crisis into broader advocacy that could benefit multiple communities of vulnerable individuals. By Monday morning, the first compensation checks were being distributed to investor families who had feared they would lose their life savings due to Marcus's theft. The teacher whose retirement account had been looted received a check that restored her financial security after 30 years of public service. The small business owner whose children's college funds had been stolen was able to resume planning for their educational futures. The elderly couple whose medical expense savings had been embezzled could continue necessary health care without choosing between treatment and financial security. Each compensation represented not only financial relief for affected families, but also validation of the strategic thinking and leadership capabilities that had enabled me to transform personal betrayal into comprehensive advocacy for economic abuse victims. The woman Marcus had taught to doubt her intelligence was demonstrating analytical and leadership skills that were protecting dozens of families, while ensuring that his criminal behavior faced appropriate consequences. However, the breakthrough decision also established expectations and responsibilities that would define my future role as someone who possessed both the resources and the strategic capabilities necessary to address systematic patterns of economic abuse that affected vulnerable individuals across multiple communities. The transformation from victim to advocate was complete, But it was also just the beginning of broader leadership responsibilities that would test my capabilities in ways that personal crisis had not required. The decision to deploy $15 million for victim compensation while pursuing comprehensive legal action against Marcus represented the completion of my transformation from someone who had been systematically manipulated and exploited into someone who possessed the confidence, capabilities, and resources necessary to protect other vulnerable individuals from experiencing similar betrayal. Marcus had created his most formidable opponent by teaching me to doubt capabilities that I had never actually lost. The breakthrough decision demonstrated that his greatest manipulation had become the foundation for leadership that would ensure his criminal behavior faced consequences that extended far beyond individual punishment to encompass systemic change, that would protect future victims from economic abuse and financial exploitation. The point of no return had been reached. The transformation was complete. The woman who had been trained to seek approval for household purchases had become someone capable of deploying massive resources to protect dozens of families, while ensuring that criminal behavior faced comprehensive consequences. The strategic thinking that Marcus had convinced me did not exist had proven superior to his own planning capabilities, and the leadership skills he had systematically undermined had emerged stronger and more effective than anything I had possessed, before his manipulation forced me to rediscover my true capabilities. The breakthrough decision had been made. Justice would be comprehensive, protection would be immediate, and the future would be defined by leadership rather than victimization. Marcus's education about the true capabilities of the woman he had so systematically underestimated was about to expand beyond personal consequences to encompass the broader recognition that economic abuse victims could become powerful advocates for systemic change when provided with appropriate resources and support systems. 3 weeks after implementing the victim compensation strategy, I stood before the assembled board of the Pacific Justice Fund in the gleaming conference room of Vivian's former headquarters, presenting the quarterly review that would document the most successful intervention in the Foundation's 5-year history. The transformation from Marcus's systematically manipulated victim to recognized leader in economic abuse advocacy had occurred with a speed and comprehensiveness that surprised even the experienced professionals who had guided similar recoveries for dozens of other women facing comparable betrayals. The statistics themselves told a remarkable story of strategic execution and humanitarian impact. 63 investor families had received full compensation for their losses within 72 hours of my decision to deploy Pacific Justice Fund resources for victim protection. The average recovery time for similar financial fraud cases typically ranged from 18 months to 3 years, assuming successful prosecution and asset recovery. By contrast, our intervention had provided immediate relief while preserving legal claims that would ultimately exceed the initial compensation amounts through comprehensive asset recovery and punitive damages. The Chen case represents a paradigm shift in how we approach complex financial fraud with multiple victims, explained Dr. Patricia Morrison, the Foundation's research director and a former federal prosecutor who specialized in economic crimes against vulnerable populations. Traditional approaches require victims to wait for legal proceedings while facing potential financial ruin. Sophia's strategy demonstrated that immediate intervention can protect victims while actually strengthening rather than compromising legal remedies against perpetrators. The broader implications extended far beyond the immediate case to establish new frameworks for addressing systematic economic abuse that could be applied to similar situations, involving manipulative spouses who exploited financial dependence to facilitate theft and abandonment. The documentation we had created during Marcus's prosecution was already being used by law enforcement agencies in 4 other states to investigate comparable cases involving venture capital professionals who had used their expertise to defraud both family members and investor clients. However, the most personally satisfying element of our success was the comprehensive nature of Marcus's legal consequences, which had exceeded every expectation for accountability and deterrent effect. Federal prosecutors had secured plea agreements That resulted in Marcus accepting 22 years in federal prison plus restitution requirements that would ensure he faced financial consequences for decades after his eventual release. State prosecutors had obtained additional convictions for identity theft and domestic fraud that would prevent him from accessing any professional licenses or financial credentials that might enable future exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The plea agreements had been facilitated by the victim compensation strategy, which removed the urgency that might have pressured prosecutors to accept more lenient sentences in exchange for Marcus's cooperation with asset recovery efforts. By ensuring that victims received immediate protection, we had created conditions where justice could be pursued without compromise, based on external pressures to prioritize speed over appropriateness of consequences. Marcus Chen will serve as a cautionary example for any professional who might consider exploiting family relationships or client trust to facilitate financial fraud, explained Detective Maria Santos during her presentation to the Pacific Justice Fund Board. The comprehensive evidence that Sophia developed, combined with the strategic legal approach she enabled through victim compensation, resulted in prosecution that addressed every aspect of his criminal behavior while protecting all affected families. The recognition from law enforcement professionals who had initially doubted whether domestic financial abuse cases could be prosecuted effectively represented a personal vindication that transcended the satisfaction of recovering stolen assets or protecting innocent victims. Detective Santos had specifically acknowledged that my investigation and evidence documentation had been superior to the work typically produced by professional forensic accountants, validating the analytical capabilities that Marcus had systematically convinced me to doubt. More significantly, the success had attracted attention from advocacy organizations, legal professionals, and policymakers who recognized that our approach could be scaled to address systematic patterns of economic abuse affecting thousands of women whose manipulative spouses used similar tactics to facilitate exploitation and abandonment. The Pacific Justice Fund was receiving inquiries from family law attorneys across the country who wanted to understand how immediate victim protection could be integrated with comprehensive legal remedies to address complex fraud cases. Sophia has demonstrated that economic abuse victims can become powerful advocates for systemic change when provided with appropriate resources and professional support, explained Catherine Whitney during her report to the Foundation Board. Her transformation from victim to leader occurred within weeks, rather than the months or years typically required for similar psychological and strategic development. The speed of my transformation had surprised everyone, including the mental health professionals who typically worked with economic abuse victims to rebuild confidence and analytical capabilities that had been systematically undermined by manipulative partners. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Foundation's consulting psychologist, had documented my case as an example of how intellectual capabilities remained intact, even after years of psychological manipulation, waiting to be reclaimed when circumstances provided appropriate motivation and support. The Marcus Chen case demonstrates that educated women who experience economic abuse retain their analytical and strategic thinking capabilities even when systematic manipulation has convinced them otherwise, Dr. Chen explained during her psychological assessment presentation. Sophia's rapid development of sophisticated legal and financial strategies suggests that her intellectual abilities had never been diminished, merely suppressed by environmental factors that disappeared when she gained access to validation and resources. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.